Welcome to AEIOU, a podcast about Austria. I'm Andrew, your host. The first thing I want to do today is acknowledge and thank someone who recently gave this podcast a nice plug and an opportunity for greater exposure. This episode, number 23, is scheduled to be released in February 2025, so it will have been several weeks since the events I'm referring to here. But since I record episodes several weeks in advance, I'm just now getting the opportunity to incorporate this info into an episode. If you're a fan of historical podcasts, then you might already know about the Presidencies podcast, which covers the history of the American presidency from George Washington to the present. Around the turn of the last year, Jerry, one of the two hosts of the Presidencies podcast, reached out to me and asked whether I'd like to do a reading for a forthcoming episode. I replied that I would, and I recorded a reading of a letter from James Monroe, then U.S. Secretary of State, to three diplomatic and military leaders on the topic of the Second Barbary War, which the United States fought against Algiers just as the bigger and longer War of 1812 was coming to a close. The Presidencies podcast incorporated my reading into its episode 4.38 entitled Shortest War Ever. Jerry and his team also provided a very nice plug to this podcast, and I'd like to return the favor here. Jerry has been producing a high-quality podcast for more than 7 years now, and he has produced more than 250 episodes over that time. He's set a benchmark to which rookie historian podcasters like myself can aspire. The episodes are interesting and engaging, and they provide an open door to further research on a topic if that's your thing. If I were teaching a course on the American presidency or American history generally, I could do far worse than to recommend to students the Presidencies podcast as a great starting point for one of the 45 men who have held America's highest office. So give the Presidencies podcast a visit. I'll provide a link in the show notes. Now back to our own podcast. As our last episode ended, we learned that the man to become Chancellor of Austria in May 1932 would be Engelbert Dollfuss, who was then serving as the Minister of Agriculture and Forestry. Dollfuss's government brought together the Christian Socials, the Landbund, and the Heimatblock. While Dollfuss had been a Christian Social Party government minister, he was still a relative unknown. He was also quite young, just 39 years old when he was appointed. The previous 6 chancellors had all been at least 50. In addition, in an era already marked by the importance of the visual image in newspapers, Dollfuss was very short, shorter than 5 feet tall. He had in fact been turned down for military service in World War I because he did not meet the minimum height requirement, although he ultimately convinced an induction board in a different town to accept him. As a result, he had served for more than 3 years on the Italian front. Dollfuss would prove to be the most consequential leader of the interwar period for Austria. On the one hand, he staunchly defended and ultimately gave his life for the cause of Austrian independence. On the other hand, he systemically dismantled Austrian democracy and, in the process of doing so, made himself a dictator. To say that his legacy is controversial would be an understatement. John Boyer, the most important historian of Austria writing in English, describes Dollfuss as follows, quote, "Although small of stature and sometimes incoherent in his woolly cultural beliefs, Dollfuss had 3 assets that made him distinctive. He was supremely self-confident, proud of operating on the basis of his instincts, and able to take arduous decisions amid a tumult of daily crises while receiving inconsistent advice by colleagues who were sure that Dollfuss must do what they themselves had been unable or unwilling to do." End quote. Although his relations with its leadership were generally good, Dollfuss faced challenges to his authority almost immediately from the Heimwehr. Heimwehr members in the legislature voted against the chancellor's proposals, and 2 of them even voted with the GDVP in a motion of no confidence against Dollfuss in August 1932. It was predicted that the new chancellor would soon find himself out of power. On October 16th of that year, a march through Vienna was held by the Nazis, and the left-wing Republikaner Schutzbund came out to counter-protest, along with allies from the tiny Communist Party. Shots rang out, and 4 people were killed before order was restored. In response, Dollfuss created a state secretariat for security and put the Heimwehr leader in Vienna, Emil Fey, in charge of it. Fey, in turn, immediately banned marches in the capital by the Nazis, Social Democrats, and Communists. The country was drifting closer and closer to authoritarianism, and a chance to fully pull the trigger presented itself in March of the following year. A crisis had been set off by a railway workers' strike. Different parties in the National Rat responded with different solutions to the problem. While an initial vote on a measure proposed by the GNVP was passed, Karl Renner, the first Chancellor of the Austrian Republic and now the presiding member of the National Rat, raised an objection. A new vote was called, and Renner resigned his position as president of the National Rat to be able to participate in the second vote. At that point, Rudolf Ramek, also a former chancellor, held the presidency next and declared the second vote, which had passed the measure again, invalid. Ramek then also stepped down from the presidency in protest and was succeeded by GDVP member Sepp Strafner, who immediately stepped down as well. There was no one left to step in as presiding officer, so the session was adjourned. Whether the three presidents on that day were aware of it or not, they had opened the door for Dollfuss to finally end Austrian democracy. 3 days later, he declared a state of emergency and stated that the National Rat would be suspended until further notice. He used as an excuse for doing so that the Austrian constitution had no remedy for the situation of three presidents of the National Rat resigning with no one left to step in and fill the role. When the Social Democrats and GDVP attempted to meet in the National Rat on March 15th, federal police prevented most of the members from entering the building and detained those who were already there. 5 days later, Dollfuss and the Heimwehr leader Ernst Rudiger Starhemberg created the Fatherland Front, a big tent political organization that would encompass both men's parties as well as the Landbund. 4 days after that, the Social Democrats' newspapers and militia were outlawed. In May, one of the parties outside the Fatherland Front, the Communist Party, was banned, and a month after that, the Nazis were banned as well. The Social Democrats were not subjected to a ban, but were now the only legal party outside the Fatherland Front. A petition with 1 million signatures was presented to President Miklas to fire Dollfuss and appoint a new government, but Miklas refused. For all intents and purposes, Austrian democracy was finished. That was not the end of civil unrest, however. A Nazi attempted to assassinate Dollfuss in October 1933, but was unsuccessful. In response to the assassination attempt, Dollfuss declared martial law. Using the powers now available to him with this declaration, Dollfuss now sought a final confrontation with the Social Democrats. The new year of 1934 brought with it Dollfuss's attempt to wipe out any remaining armed cells of the Social Democrats. On February 12th, in Linz, the capital of Upper Austria and one-time hometown of history's most famous Austrian, Social Democrats at their headquarters in the Hotel Schiff opened fire on government troops sent to confiscate weapons. That this short civil war broke out in Linz is, in hindsight, unsurprising. After all, it was in Linz in 1926 that the Social Democrats had sworn to seize power and establish a dictatorship of the proletariat if democracy in Austria were abolished. The violence spread from Linz across the country, but was quickly put down in Vienna first and subsequently across the country by the 15th. The Civil War had lasted a mere 4 days. Unsurprisingly, the Social Democratic Workers' Party of Austria was banned outright, and many of its members were arrested. 24 were tried and sentenced to death, with 9 of the 24 executed. Others were confined to a detention camp near Wiener Neustadt. Austria was now a one-party state. In April 1934, Dollfuss convened a legislative session of deputies from the Fatherland Front only, mainly for the purpose of drafting a new constitution. On May 1st, this new constitution was put into effect. The Republic was officially replaced by an authoritarian state. The preamble to the new constitution is helpful in understanding how the new constitution conceived of Austria. It reads, quote, "In the name of God, the Almighty, from whom all law emanates, the Austrian people received this constitution for their Christian, German federal state based on corporativism," end quote. In short, the state would once again be officially Catholic, and the church would play a large role in public life. Second, the state would maintain its identity as a state of German-speaking people while also maintaining its independence. And third, the state would employ corporativism or corporatism, a form of government endorsed by the Catholic Church, particularly by Pope Pius XI in his encyclical Quadragesimo Anno, published 3 years earlier, in which the Vatican urged class collaboration rather than capitalism or socialism. A According to this form of socio-political organization, rather than labor unions and capital being in a fundamentally adversarial relationship, with capital seeking to exploit labor and labor seeking to overthrow capital, corporate bodies would be created that would negotiate fair arrangements between labor and capital, with the government acting as arbitrator. It was hoped in part that this solution would prevent further violence from occurring between the left and the right. However, the threats to Dollfuss's regime and person persisted. Ultimately, the most dire threat came from the Nazis, and in this regard, the danger came from both within Austria and outside it. Over in Germany, where history's most famous Austrian had seized power in 1933, the reaction to Dollfuss's decision to suspend the legislature was to adopt a three-pronged attack on Austria, combining economic sanctions, broad use of pro-Nazi, anti-Dollfuss propaganda by radio, and terrorism committed by the Nazis in Austria. In addition to banning the Nazis in Austria, Dollfuss undertook a diplomatic campaign to support Austrian independence, finding that his most vehement supporter was Italy's dictator Benito Mussolini, who feared Nazi irredentist claims on South Tyrol, the formerly Austrian territory that had been awarded to Italy after the Great War. Mussolini, for his own part, had assured Dollfuss at a meeting in Riccione, Italy, on August 19, 1933, that Italy would intervene on Austria's behalf should Germany act against it. In return, Mussolini had asked that Dollfuss eliminate the political left in Austria, which of course he did. Moreover, to further protect Austria, Dollfuss entered a formal alliance with Italy and Hungary in March 1934. Hitler wasn't happy about this new alliance, and he and Mussolini discussed the situation in Austria at their first meeting on June 14th, but the two men came to no agreements. Because Hitler was still the weaker of the two men in 1934, the German chancellor could not press the point with Mussolini. Consequently, Hitler opted to allow for a Nazi coup in Austria. The coup leaders, seeing Dollfuss as weak and unpopular and believing strongly in growing support for their movement in the Austrian populace at large, elected to decapitate the government in Vienna and replace Dollfuss with one of their own. Any resistance, they imagined, would be easily crushed by armed units of the Sturmabteilung, or SA, throughout the country, which had been arming despite being forced underground. They believed Mussolini would accept the Nazi coup once it was too late to roll it back. It will have to wait until the next episode to find out whether they were right. Thanks for listening.